Hello and welcome to DevOps Quick Bites, your friendly guide to all things Salesforce DevOps, with me, Rob Cowell. In this episode, I want to start exploring source control with Git, starting from the basics of what it is and why we need it, and looking at some practical examples. In later episodes, I'm going to go into a lot more detail, but I'm going to get you started in this first episode. So if that sounds good to you, stick around. So why do I actually need source control? Well, for a start, it's a good way to keep your changes safe. You have a backup of not just your data, but of your config and your code, if you have that from your developers, and pretty much every piece of setup with a few corner exceptions from your entire org. Additionally, you have an audit trail of those changes, who made the changes, when they made them, and if they're actually behaving themselves and adding suitable comments, why they made those changes. Finally, and most importantly, it allows you to share changes easily between environments. You can actually move those changes from sandbox to sandbox and into production. It's an alternative to having to work with change sets, which, as we know, have a few little quirks that can be frustrating from time to time. The most used source control system for Salesforce, and indeed other software development platforms, is of course Git. It's a distributed version control system, distributed meaning that it can be spread across multiple instances, and it tracks changes during your software development process. Now, development isn't just about code, as we all know. We can also track changes in any set of files, and this is kind of where it becomes useful to admins, as we'll see in a moment, because with Salesforce metadata, everything is a file. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of metadata, many people talk about it being data about data, but in practice it's a descriptive way of detailing your configuration changes, such as flows, validation rules, classes and triggers. It can also be your report types, your page layouts, your objects, your fields. Pretty much anything that you can define in Salesforce can be extracted out into metadata and put through source control. So now's the time to see how that works in practice. For this demo, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. And the reason for this is that it has a vast array of powerful tools for all types of editing of files. Despite the name, it's not just about code. I'll also be using the Salesforce CLI, which I'll provide some links for later. It's integrated very well with the extension plugins of Visual Studio Code, which means effectively we have a one-stop shop for working with all things Salesforce, which hopefully will make things easier to demonstrate. Okay, so I'm starting this journey in Visual Studio Code. It's a great free option for allowing us to work with metadata and with Git and get all the things we need. So apologies to the developer purists that are very much used to the dark mode. I'm using a light mode here just because it shows up better on the video. So let's get started. I am going to, using the command palette, like so, I'm going to create a brand new project to house all our metadata. So we're going to use sfdx create project. I'm just creating a standard project, and I'm going to use a fairly obvious name here because we love a bit of DevOps Quick Bites. So let's find a home for that. Just check I haven't already used that. No, we're all good. Okay. Now what this does is it creates a skeleton project for our Salesforce work. So you'll see a standard structure here for Salesforce DX projects. This is called the source format. And this is because it's kind of designed to work with source control, which is exactly what we want here. But if we expand out our folders here and say, for example, we look at our Salesforce objects, there's nothing in there. And that's because we haven't connected it to our Salesforce org yet. So let's go ahead and do that. We can just click down the bottom here where it says no default org set, like so, and we can authorize a connection to a Salesforce org. So what we have here, I'm going to use production, and the reason for this is because I span up a Salesforce developer instance very quickly for this demo. And those are treated as production editions. Normally you'd be connecting to a sandbox or a scratch org, But let's carry on with this. And we get to give it an alias. So again, I'm going to use the same name. Okay, now what that does is, if I bring it across to this screen, it opens this very familiar standard Salesforce login screen. So here is one that I prepared earlier. I shall just get logged in. Okay. Now what it's asking here, if I make that a little larger for you, is it's just checking that we're happy to grant permissions. We're not going to get very far unless we do that, so I'm just going to click allow. Okay, so we're now successfully authenticated between our Salesforce project in Visual Studio Code and our Salesforce org. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And we can see here it's successfully run. So we'll just move that out of the way. But we still haven't got any of our metadata. There's one additional step that we need to do here. So I'm going to click on this handy little cloud icon, which is our org browser. And what that allows us to do is just, as the name suggests, browse the org and see what bits of metadata we want to pull down. You can see all the various different types of metadata that Salesforce supports with its metadata API in here. So I am going to grab some objects. Now, a little gotcha here. Although that says custom objects, from the perspective of these plugins, all objects are custom objects, even the standard ones such as account, contact, opportunity, etc. So if we expand that out, we can exactly see that. Account is there, scrolling down a little bit, contact's probably not too far off, etc, etc. So let's just grab the contact object. I am going to hit the little cloud icon just here. And it produces a whole bunch of output just to confirm that it's done that. What we can actually do is look at that in the Explorer. And we can see here we now have, or should have, our contact object. We have a piece of metadata for the object itself just here. We have its list views and we have its fields. And this is quite an important feature because by bringing the fields out as separate objects, not as part of a larger piece of metadata, we can actually just change individual fields and move those back and forth in our org quite easily. But this is only half the problem. What we actually need to do now is hook this up to Git. So there's a few useful plugins within VS Code that will help us to do that. Let's go to the little Git here. It's a little source control tab here. And we can do a couple of things. So the nice thing about the Visual Studio Code plugins is that it's very point and click or menu driven and allows us to do a lot of those things without having to resort to the command line. I know the developers amongst us may prefer the command line, and there's nothing to stop you from doing that, but we want to make life easy for today's example. So the first thing I want to do is initialize a Git repository, a local store of where we're going to capture our changes. One click and we're done. Now what I personally like to do is just quickly switch on this tree view mode. It just allows us to kind of collapse a lot of the things that we don't necessarily care about at this point. All the good stuff is in this Force app main default folder. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to add my contact object. I can click here to add that. And this is something called staging, as you can see from the tooltop here. We're basically getting things ready to commit into our source control. This is kind of like when you're building a change set and you're clicking through all the check boxes and saying, okay, I want one of those, one of those, one of those, but you haven't actually saved it yet. You've not committed those changes. Now, best practice, of course, is always, like we do with when we're creating metadata, we give everything a description. It's good practice to give this thing a commit message. So I'm going to do that, initial commit of contact object. It just allows other people when they're reviewing the changes or just kind of getting a handle on the history of seeing what you've added and why you've added it. So it's just a good practice to be getting into. So I'm going to commit that now. And what that's done, that's basically said, okay, I have added these changes and I've effectively hit save on that. Now what we can see here is that we have like 17 other changes. We don't necessarily need to worry about that. But what we want to do now is get it to a point where it's not just on our local machine, it's somewhere where others can see it, can share it, can pick up our changes. Admittedly, there are no actual changes at this point. This is just a demo, but we'll show how that can work in practice. So what we need to do next is get those changes up to GitHub. It's the most common source of adding source control for others to share. So if we go back to our browser window here, and here's my GitHub. So there's a few things that I need to do here. Firstly, I need to create a new repository on GitHub to store our changes. So let's go ahead and do that. The owner can be me. The repository can be my terrible pun. Okay, again, best practice to add a description, but I'm just not going to at this point. Yeah, I can keep that public. There's nothing particularly sensitive in this org. It's just a brand new demo org. So I'm just going to create that repository. And there we go. It's created. But there's nothing in it at the minute. Now, helpfully, GitHub will give us some instructions on how to move that across. Now, we can do that from the command line and push that across, or we can do it through the various menu options and click buttons. So just to make sure that I'm kind of covering things for admins and devs alike, we're going to go into the world of the command line. So you can see here, there's some little commands that will help us navigate that. So I'm going to move that off to one side. I'm going to move that off to one side, just so that we can see things side by side a little bit. So let's open a new terminal. A terminal is basically where we're running command lines within Visual Studio. We can actually run all of that without actually having to leave there. So, oh my goodness, there are lots of bits and pieces in here. I have quite a customized command prompt, but effectively this is the same command prompt you're likely to see, whether that's in Mac or Windows. You'll have equivalents of that. So let's start copying some commands. So the first thing we want to do is copy this one and pop it in here. Now what this command will do is basically specifying that GitHub and the repository that we've just created there is our remote. A remote is basically where we're pushing the changes up and pulling changes down from. It's, as the name suggests, not on our local machine. So let's pop that in. And we've now established that remote. The next command, we are specifying which branch we want to use. By default, that's the main branch. And in fact, it might even not be needed to run this command, but just for completeness sake, we'll do that. There we go. And then the final step is we're going to push our changes from our local branch to our remote branch. So we're pushing from our local machine to the alien called Origin. Origin it's a historic thing where I don't fully understand why, but historically the default name for the remote branch is always called Origin. I don't know why, but let's just run with this. So let's pop that command in. And the changes that we committed earlier, the contact object, are going to get pushed into GitHub. No, they're not, because I haven't logged in. See, even us experts don't always get it right first time. I've got to remind myself of the command. Browser. Okay, let's. This is similar to authenticating to our Salesforce org as well. So I'm just connecting all of these things up. You wouldn't normally do this because you'd normally be logged in with GitHub. I just missed a step earlier. Okay. See, very confusing. You are already logged into this account. No, that's the wrong thing. So I need that command from earlier, that git push. Let's see if it works this time. There we go. I just wasn't successfully authenticated. So we went off at a little bit of a tangent there, but we managed to get our code pushed in. So proof, if anything, that it is a real live demo and I've not just cheated on this. So where we've got our repository that has the instructions on what we do, if we now refresh that, we can see that I've had that initial commit of the contact object here, again making that a little larger for readability. We can see by clicking on that commit name what files have changed. We can see our contact object, we can see our fields going in, we can see all the little pieces that we've done there. Now the nice thing is that our fellow developers and admins could also be connected to this same GitHub repository and pull down the changes, and that means that it's a really good way of sharing those changes and making sure that we can track what we're working on, that we're not overwriting each other's changes, and all the other benefits that we can see later, such as automation of deployments. Everything basically will run from source control and from Git, and it's kind of the central tenet, the technical underpinning of how we enable all of that automation. So very quick demo, very basic demo, and one that didn't go 100% smoothly, as real life doesn't, but I think we've kind of seen the basics there. So let's jump back to our summary and continue the video. So although we were working with Visual Studio Code and the Salesforce command line interface, don't let the fact that it's a command line interface scare you, because as we've seen, much of it is wrapped up in the Visual Studio Code extensions, which allow us to have nice little menus and mouse clicks and buttons that guide us through that process nicely. We've seen Git and GitHub as a means of storing the changes and having those captured and safeguarded locally, and then that local copy replicated up to GitHub. We've seen the process of how we move changes between our org and Git via Visual Studio. We check the code out of our org, make the changes, and then we commit it back up into GitHub. There is much more complexity to Git beneath the surface, but there's some terms to be aware of for later research. Firstly, branching, where we take a copy of the main Git branch and we make our feature-based changes, and then we merge those back into the main branch. Now, that's slightly more complex than I'm going to include in this video, but I've linked some of the resources on Git branching in the description for you. Potentially, with that process of merging our changes back in, you may have what are called merge conflicts, whereby you could have multiple admins or developers that have changed the same items in parallel, and you need to reconcile the two together to work out what's the aggregate set of changes that will make it into your Git branch. Like the branching, merging is something that I'm going to cover in a future video, but in the meantime, there's some resources in the description such as the Git module on Trailhead and some of the resources on DevOps Launchpad, which will guide you through in a lot more detail around the usage of Git, branching strategies and merging techniques. So be sure to go and check that out, and also subscribe to this channel for that next video. In the meantime, hopefully that's whetted your appetite for all things Git, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.